So Zelenskyy's speech to the UN was very powerful. What did you make of what he said?
Yes, look, it was a very powerful speech and a very important one, coming as it did now, after we're starting to see the images of what the Russians have been doing in these places that they had control of, and they've started to pull back. And interestingly, or importantly, I think he used that forum and played a 90-second clip of the bodies in Bucha, and that was clearly very shocking for a lot of people, although even that, a lot of people in the Assembly, even though that information had been doing the rounds of our screens for the last 12 hours or so. But, it just shows how, although he's stressed, that the institution needs reform, that the Russians should be expelled from the UN Security Council, that it was failing in its job to actually guarantee peace in the world, I mean, I think he's asking the UN to do perhaps more than it can in some ways, because what it actually does do is provide a forum for someone like him to actually talk to the world. And he did it so very effectively, and that's why it's dominating the news agenda since he did it.
Just in terms of what the UN and other world leaders can do, we heard there that more sanctions are being brought in, banning imports, and there's, we hear that these sanctions already in place are starting to work. Are they starting to work? They don't seem to be.
Well, I think, look...
in terms of stopping military action.
They're certainly not stopping military action, but this is a longer-term strategy about weakening the Russian economy and undermining the leadership of Vladimir Putin. Interestingly, I thought that when the first round of sanctions were put in place, people thought, that's pretty strong action. Well, actually, they had quite a lot in reserve, it seems, because the sanctions that are now being talked about are really going to hit quite hard. I mean, the banning coal imports from Russia, for instance, of 4 billion euros a year. The idea that they are now going to stop the transport corridors and trucks coming in and out of Belarus and Russia will impact Russian industry quite significantly. Talking about oil and gas, seriously talking about oil, which sort of underpins the Russian economy, and if they really do stop preventing oil exports from Russia, that's going to have a massive impact on the Russian economy. So yes, I think there is the sanctions will have quite an impact, and there is still a long way to go, but it's a longer-term strategy, clearly.
Michael, it's such a heavily reported war. There are lots of journalists on the ground, as well as satellites and drones. Why did we not know what was happening in Bucha?
Well, good question. There are a lot of journalists there. We are getting a lot of information out. Clearly, there are some areas where journalists, it's just too dangerous or people aren't going. I mean, we did get some quite interesting and dramatic and courageous reporting out of places like Irpin, north of Kiev. Obviously you can't cover every aspect of the war, but the other interesting thing about this war, I mean, look, every war is about not just about controlling the military, but controlling the flow of information as much as anything else. And the Russians have been very good at controlling the information within their own borders. So Vladimir Putin has clamped down quite hard on local reporting, on local media outlets, but they're also trying very hard to influence how the West and the rest of the world sees the war. As we saw at the UN Security Council, the Russian ambassador there basically outright denying that Russians were responsible for the deaths of the people in Bucha, and saying that this was fake news. They also are well aware that they have to try and stop the truth getting out there as much as possible. And we saw in Mariupol, for instance, that it was really only through the work of a couple of AP photojournalists that we learned about the attacks on the hospitals there, that we learned about those dramatic images of the pregnant woman being dragged out of the hospital on a stretcher. And the Russians actually came looking for those two journalists specifically to try and get rid of them, because they were so concerned about the impact of that information.
In terms of the latest on the ground then, Russian forces are regrouping. Where are they going? Where's the focus going to be? So
they're basically withdrawn from around Kiev. They're moving and regrouping back toward the east of the country. It's thought, I don't think anyone really has a good handle on it, but it's thought that they are going to regroup there and resupply, because they do have some problems with a lot of the equipment and the military hardware that they've had to abandon on their way out. So we've seen those pictures of the Ukrainians going over the tanks and pulling out as much of the weaponry as they can and recycling it. So the Russians have left a lot of their hardware behind. They now have to replace all of that. They're going to strengthen those positions in the east. They'll strengthen their positions in the south around Mariupol and the Black Sea. But the NATO Secretary-General earlier today was saying that they're expecting that within a couple of weeks the Russians will then start to push out again from those eastern fronts.